Welcome to the Adventures Club of Los Angeles. My name is Andrew McGregor, and I have the prodigious privilege of serving as first vice president this year. We are a club that for the past 100+ years has met almost every Thursday, rain, shine, pandemic, or war, to meet, discuss, and swap stories around the exquisite art of adventure and leaving the beaten path. And in that grand tradition, I'm enthralled to welcome to our stage Victoria Lautman, who's the author of this amazing book, The Vanishing Stepwells of India, which I encourage everyone to read as I have. Victoria, thank you for blessing our club.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a lifelong dream to come to this place, and hoping one day it will be open to people like me as a member. Hint, hint, hint. Yes, ladies, give it up for that, for genderhood.
Yes, that camera is your direct portal, so just, and then we'll open up afterwards. Yeah, so look at me and we'll be fine. Awesome, so what's a stepwell?
Well, let me point your attention to the pictures on the screen, which show the cover of two of these books. And if we could go to the next slide, please. And I want to thank Andrew for having me, and David for his great, introduction when I came in, and also to Phyllis for facilitating this. I did not know what a stepwell was. I was an art historian, a journalist. I'd traveled to India 35 years ago after just waking up one day and deciding this is a place I really wanted to go. I had absolutely no idea anything about India. I could recognize the Taj Mahal, that was about it. I went to India then, and during the 30 days that I was there with a group of architects traveling all over the country, we were taken to the place that you see on this slide. It was basically at that point a dirt lot out in the desert of Googe Route, and the taxi driver said, get out and walk to that wall that you see in the distance and look over it. Now at the time, there was no grass, there was no tower, there were no trees, and I was thinking, this guy's like crazy. Why do I want to do that? There's nothing. Who cares about this wall? And next slide, please. When I got over and looked over the wall, it was the most disconcerting experience of the ground falling away into this man-made chasm that descended. I couldn't even tell how far. All I could tell was that there were a series of platforms and carved columns going down, I didn't know how many feet. Next slide. And I decided to enter this space, and it was like nothing I'd ever seen. I'd studied architecture, studied art history, thought I knew all the kinds of architecture in the world, but I'd never seen anything like this. It was a subterranean structure that shifted my visual perspective the further down that I progressed underground. So you can see it was like this series of views that kept shifting the further down I got. Next slide. And it activated all of my senses. Next slide, please. The further down I went, in India, those of you, I know a lot of you have traveled there, it's an extremely hot environment, a noisy environment. It's smelly, loud. And with every step that I took on this journey down to the bottom of this thing that I could not tell how far down it went, how deep it was, how long it was, or even what it was, the air became so much cooler with every step, and the din above ground became hushed, and the bright light became dimmed. Next slide, please. Until I got to the bottom, and there was this pool of water, and it was just this dark, mesmerizing environment. Next slide. Looking up to the ceiling, which at that point is 6 stories above where I was, and that's ground level that you're looking up to. And it was a transformative experience walking into this thing, and you feel during that moment of entering the earth, having these monumental structures towering over you as the very air around you changed. It was transformative, and it was exactly the way that it would have been experienced 500 years ago. And I thought, what the hell is this thing? It was a stepwell. Next slide. And nowhere in any of the guidebooks about India, any of my architecture books, any of my art history classes that I'd seen, had anybody ever referred to one of these structures. That particular one is from right around 1500. And very technically, as you can see in this diagram, a stepwell was something that really only exists on the subcontinent. It was a type of architecture that evolved specifically to accommodate the capricious weather system of India, and also now in, well, the entire subcontinent, so Pakistan too. So in order to supply water 24/7 all year long, they had to reach a water supply that would be dry, arid for 10 months out of the year, and then the monsoon would hit for 2 months and the water table would get filled. So the idea is, you can see at the bottom there, you had to dig a well that hit the groundwater during the driest season. It could be 10 stories underground, and then create a series of steps that allowed access during the driest season. When the water table began to fill up, you didn't have to go down 200 steps with a jug of water on your head twice a day. The water can actually fill all the way to the top of that staircase, and then the system would repeat itself as the water receded, and it would repeat every year. Next slide. You can see this is a stepwell in Delhi, and you can see just very, in a minimal way, what that water fluctuation is like. Some of these wells, you just can't see the bottom of ever. Next slide. But besides being water receptacles and water harvesting structures that were incredibly efficient for 1,500 years, they were also the most multifunctional structures in India. So besides providing water, they were also subterranean temples for Hindus. They were also very functional for Muslims and Jains, and really every religion used stepwells in some way. Next slide, please. They were important centers for women, particularly in India, who had such constrained lives. And they're the ones that, of course, we're the ones that have to get water twice, 3 times a day. And they're still very important social centers you see in India today, the women gathering at the well. Next slide. And women actually responsible, we think, for commissioning 25% of the stepwells that were ever created in India, of which we don't have an exact number. That's a separate story, which we can talk about. But you see a lot of stepwells that were, they were very expensive, commissioned by royal women, wealthy women, to commemorate their deceased husbands, their sons. They never, unfortunately, commemorated another woman, but that's just the way it is in India. But whenever you see a stepwell that says Rani or a woman's name, it's one of the only ways that women's names are recorded in India. So they were very important charitable gifts to the community. The next slide. They were also very important along trade routes throughout India, where there were, you could go a day without seeing water. You needed to have a supply for your caravan. And by the way, these are all pictures that I took. I forgot to bring my little camera, but I always travel with a tiny little, it's just a terrible camera. It's a cheap, I hold it in my teeth to go into these places, and I always had it set on automatic. If it ever went off automatic, I'd panic. But all the pictures in my book are my photographs, so those cameras really are pretty good. And this picture was actually taken out along a trade route in the middle of nowhere, not on a map. This guy that you see, I was lamenting trying to find these stepwells in the middle of nowhere, and he's like, oh, I know where there's one. And I put him in my car, and we scampered off into the wilderness. And the minute we found this unknown stepwell, it's not recorded anywhere, he just lightly took his hand and went like this to the surface of the water and started drinking it, exactly as would have happened when this was built. It's a very, very old stepwell from about 600 AD. Next slide. They were also very important cooling centers. It can be 120 degrees. In fact, it is right now in parts of India. And so by the time you get to the bottom of a stepwell, it can be 10 degrees cooler than at the top level, which is really important when you're hot. And later, after the Muslims came to India, they created a whole different type of stepwell so that you could actually live in, you can see in the slide on the right how these beautiful loggias that you could actually stay and tie up your animals, stay there for days and rest and get water. They were incredibly multifunctional structures, which again made me wonder, why don't we know about these? And I became obsessed. Next slide. And you need to ask me anything at this point?
One of the favorite...
Because I'll just keep going.
That's cool. Yeah, one of the favorite lines from your book, you made the comment that you don't choose your obsessions, your obsessions choose you. And I immediately thought of that Nietzsche quote. I'll paraphrase, like, don't look into the abyss lest the abyss looks into you.
Right.
And so I was imagining you in that moment. I guess could you, before we move on, talk about personally why it became an obsession, even though you didn't pick the obsession? Like, what was it about this? Because, I mean, to a degree, there are inverted temples, right? People love the Taj Mahal and that part of Indian architecture, but this, you're right, it's not nearly as well known, but what was it about you that when the abyss looked into you, you're like, yeah? Well,
first of all, and I do have a picture a little while later of the one where I, decided, okay, I'm gonna go and study these. I went to India. I started going for 3 months every winter and became obsessed with these at that time and started to write about them. And because I had seen that first one 35 years ago, I thought that was such a powerful memory. That place was so cool. But in the 8 times I'd gone back to India after that, I never went and saw another one. It has to be sort of intentional because they're not on any map, on any guidebook, at least then. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do some research about that. And when I got to India, I started to look at some. And it turned out that even though I'd been in Delhi and around Delhi 6 times, I had never seen one of the stepwells there. And there are at least 20 you can see right in the city. And just outside the city, I went to just see one. And they were really interesting to me at that point. But there was one in particular, which is, you'll see. And I don't know, it really is like what people describe as love at first sight. It was just like, bam. I was looking at something that was so complex architecturally, so old, so decrepit, that was really hard to find. Like, I had to drive around in circles for hours trying to find this thing. They have no above ground presence at all because they're subterranean. And there's very few of them that actually have like a tower or anything to show you, here's a stepwell. And there was something at that moment about realizing that there was this incredible form of architecture that it felt like I had discovered it, which wasn't true, obviously. They'd been there for a very long time. But that nobody I knew about them. I started posting them on Facebook, and people were like, what the hell is that thing? And I became obsessed with the idea that there was something that I could go and look at that nobody else knew about that was really hard to find, but incredibly beautiful. They are marvels of architecture and engineering and art that in some cases completely surpass anything else that was done at that time in the world. I'll show a picture later on. So yeah, I had never intended on writing a book. I didn't want to write a book. Specifically, I didn't want to write a book because there's so little documented about them that I'm not a scholar. I'm a journalist, and so I don't read Urdu, and I have very bad Hindi. So I didn't want to spend years like going through the National Archives of India, which is basically rat-infested anyway, trying to find references to these things like in Urdu. But nobody had written anything. They were part of the background noise of India. So when I got an offer to do this book, and this crazy publisher in India, it's a beautiful book. He did a great job, but he's a jerk. Oh my God, I still want to kill him, and it's been like 4 years.
Do you know a big hole in the ground where you could?
Yeah, there's a lot of places where I could dump his body, never to be found. Oh. But he said, okay, yeah, do the book 3 months. And I was like, it was just, I almost died trying to like figure out how to write this book. But it's, to me, as a journalist, that is the perfect storm. You find a topic that nobody knows about, so nobody can challenge you about, like, I could be telling you BS right now and nobody would know, but I'm telling you what I know. There's a lot of mistakes in the book that I subsequently found out are incorrect, but that is part of the obsession. I found something that was new, that nobody knew about. I wanted to bring it to the public so that people would go and see them and could thereby preserve these things. And that's exactly what's happening now.
Yeah, and the preservation's pretty fascinating because there's one example where it was kind of a spiritual revival. In other cases, it gets labeled an UNESCO World Site, and then the Indian government intervenes. Can you kind of speak to that?
Well, let me show you. Can I show some
please.
of these pictures? Because what is important to know about these is that we don't know anything about them. Like, you read these things that say there are several thousand of them. No, there were way more than several thousand. We have no idea. Like, they tended to be built in the dry western states of India, but there were probably thousands at any given time. We have no idea how many existed and how many are gone. But I've seen over 200 now in probably 9 states in India, and there are no two alike. The pictures there that you're seeing show a kind of a variety that's based really on the geography there, or geology rather. The stylistic range is enormous, but the one on the left you see there, which is in Delhi, that is built on very rocky soil, and so it didn't really need any kind of support in it. You can actually, if you look closely, can see the boulders protruding out of the side of it that they just allowed to exist there, and they even carved some of the columns out of the boulders, whereas the one on the right is from the sandy soil of Googe Route, and you can see that crazy, people compare these a lot to Escher, and it's true. I mean, you can't even really understand what's happening architecturally in that, because so much of it is about buttressing that structure, which goes down 5 stories. And I talked to a lot of engineers when I was writing this book. It's like, how was it really hard to do these? I didn't know. And they were like, it's much harder to excavate a structure 10 stories below ground in pre-industrial India, basically with your hands and some oxen, than it is to build up like a lot of the temples. The next slide, please. But there's a huge variety just in terms of the style, too, from tiny little ones like the one on the right to that huge one, which is a UNESCO site, which is just ginormous. Next slide. Some of them are incredibly utilitarian and plain, like the one on the left there, but on the right, you can see a lot of them incorporate incredible carving and sculpture. The next slide, please. A lot of them, in terms of shape, are this straight shotgun. That one is so long you could fire a gun and it would go straight down the middle. On the right, you can see also that it's just like you're building a straight corridor with a bore well at the end, and these stairs just accessing. Very, very simple form. Next slide, please. Or these L shapes, which nobody knows why. Why did they make giant L-shaped stepwells? Who knows? Next slide. Or these beautiful round shapes. Some are very elaborate, some are just the simplest little curl, like that one on the right. Next slide. Or really eccentric shapes, like the one on the left is just insane. I didn't even know how to, I took that picture from somebody's rooftop. I couldn't even get into it. Or octagonal ones, or really just bizarre forms. Next slide. Or some which are defined by the shape itself, the kund, which is the steepest form of a stepwell. And next slide, is defined by these patterns of stairs. Yeah, they're just extraordinary, these pyramidal stairs. I'd like to remind you that I entered all of these, except for the ones that were literally cut off, because a lot of them, the city has grown up around them. But like, I had to go to the bottom of these things, and I'm scared of heights. It was terrifying. That was an adventure. Finding them was an adventure. Next slide, please. But these kunds, like, you just can't take a bad picture of them. They're extraordinary things, but it allowed you to get to the water much quicker than if you started with, those kind of lateral staircases that go straight out. Next slide. And this is one in Varanasi in India, which is really steep. But once a year, there's a festival at this thing during the monsoon, where it's a very, very holy site. And, in my book, there is that question mark, like, for the date, because in my research for this, there's nothing that exists on this. There's literally no reference to it. It says, this is an old stepwell. It's very old. Okay, so Varanasi is one of the oldest continually lived in cities on the planet. So what is old in Varanasi? I just put down 1,000. I mean, I had to put something. I didn't know. I'm totally wrong. But it's a fascinating site that's considered very holy. Once a year, it's just flooded with couples coming to dip. The women struggle down that stair, thousands of them in one day, dip in the water because they think that they will then be blessed with a male child because of the water is particularly holy that day. And they leave their clothes behind and jewelry, which is just this giant mess that the priests who take care of it are constantly cleaning it up. Next slide, please. Oh, that's just a picture. I can't even get close to that to show you. It sort of gives you an idea, if you haven't been to India, of where the different locations are. Next slide. I'm trying to get to the one that you're referencing, which is Rani Ki Vav, which became a World Heritage Site. But in order to do that, I have to go back. I have to go back through some of the history.
We'll get there when we need to get there.
Is that okay?
Please, enjoy, yeah.
Okay, well,
no rush.
I mean, the history of these is just fascinating in terms of their structure because, you know, the Indians needed to have a water source all year round. And in order to get it, they started around the 3rd century AD, we believe, by literally hacking through solid rock to get to the water. And so the earliest ones, and these are older, but it gives you an idea of these rock-cut stepwells, which are quite spectacular, but they were not structural. It was just cut through the rock, get to the water. Next slide, please. The earliest ones, which are coincidentally the hardest to find, in Googe Route, India, from around 600, this was an adventure. Because it's interesting, this trio, actually now 4, because I found a 4th, are the oldest known structural stepwells in India. And they're filled with garbage, as are many stepwells in India. And I just was thinking it's very scary going into these things because you can't see the stairs. There's snakes, there's bugs, there's rats. You don't know if you're gonna fall and die, which I thought I would. You can't really tell how deep they are, what's at the end. I literally thought I was gonna die every time I went in one of these, and there was nobody telling me to do it. I was just thinking, I have to go and see this, you know, and figure out, I gotta get some pictures of it. But I was just in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a couple weeks ago, and the oldest house in America is in Santa Fe. It's an adobe from, I don't know, late 16th, early 17th century. And I tell you, if you touch it, there's going to be a SWAT team coming down and whisking you away, and you'll be in federal prison for the rest of your life. You know, they're so protected, every single thing. And yet in India, there's so much that is old, and people just didn't care. Like in this tiny village where I finally found it, I asked and asked, where is this stepwell? Nobody had any idea. And it was there in the middle of town. Okay, next slide, please. Within just a few hundred years, the technology for creating stepwells was such that you could build something like this, Chand Bowery, which if any of you have been to India, this is just 15 minutes off the main road from Jaipur to Agra. And yet very few people have seen this. It's been in Batman, in Batman, The Dark Knight Rises, it was the prison. It was in a movie called The Fall. It's one of the most extraordinary structures, one of the oldest, deepest, and largest stepwells in India, and also one that combines 2 different faiths across 1,000 years, 2 different styles of architecture. And you can see this is a kund. It has 3,500 steps. There's probably many bodies at the bottom. When I first saw it, I don't remember, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there weren't any handrails around it, but eventually somebody went and fell And so now you can't even climb into it. But you can see that that very flat kind of style of architecture and the flat, they almost look like Frank Lloyd Wright, squat little openings. That's early Hindu architecture. The Hindu style did not have a true arch or a true dome. That was brought to India by Islam, by the Muslims, not until like the 15th century. So later, in the 18th century, the local Muslim ruler, taken over from the Hindus at that point, decides to build his own retreat slammed right onto the Hindu structure. So you get this kind of melding, like a transporter malfunction, between these two different styles. And in fact, when you go there, and I can't show this with my pointer, but right at the water level, there are still these two Hindu deities that are overseeing the water that would have been submerged, still are submerged when the water rises. It's one of the most extraordinary things. Keep going, another slide, please. But, you know, the idea that, for instance, I know hundreds of people have been to India and never seen that, but they've been by it a million times on that road. These stepwells are so often within eyesight of very important tourist destinations. People have no idea. They're hiding in plain sight. And because often you have no idea it's there. I mean, this one, which is at the Red Fort in India, which is the most touristed site in Delhi, if you were just walking along without paying attention, you would literally just splat into that thing. There's nothing to keep you from falling into it. Next slide. We don't know when this was built. They think it's around 1400. Nobody really knows. You can see it's a beautiful, like, mirror shape, very unusual. And if you look closely at the slide on the right there, when the British Raj came to India and to Delhi, they took over that site and they established barracks, British barracks on that site, and they turned this particular stepwell into a jail for Indian freedom fighters right around 1947. And if you look closely at my terrible picture, I can't believe I took that stupid picture, you can still see the bars going across the windows from where the British threw the freedom fighters. Then when the British were forced out in 1947, the Indian Army took this over and turned it into a toilet until the Archaeological Survey of India finally took control of it. Next slide. The idea of hiding in plain sight is something that also was really appealing. You said, you know, what grabbed me about these? There is a real treasure hunt quality to these things. And, you know, I've given talks in India where people can't believe that they lived like across the street. This is a great example. This one, which is right in the middle of Delhi. Just walking down this road, it's a beautiful little residential quiet street right off the main drag, and there is a gate there. Next slide. And you walk through it, and then wham, you're right at the top of this thing. This is a very plain stepwell. It's not even that big a deal. That would have been on the outskirts of Delhi when it was built 600 years ago. It would have been a stop for pilgrims, people going in and out of the city, traveling. When I first used to go and see this, it was considered one of the most haunted places in India. It was really creepy. They're very creepy when you're there by yourself, you know, birds flapping, bugs and snakes all over the place. But now, because this really bad but very funny Bollywood movie came out in, I think, 2015. It was called PK with Amir Khan, great Bollywood star. And he plays an alien who takes up residence in this stepwell. And so now when you go and you see it, there's always like couples canoodling inside those little places because there's never anywhere for them to go and make out. So it's really fun. Like now it's very activated in a way that no stepwell was ever activated in history. Next slide, please. This is the one where I fell in love. This is the one that, again, if you go to India, a lot of people drive from Delhi to Jaipur. It's a 5-hour drive. Right halfway, there's an incredible little hill fort called Nimrana. It was the first fort hotel in India. Great lunch you can have there, overlooking the valley. But outside of the village, again, driving up and down, I began to realize that when you see walls like that, you just got to stop. It's become Pavlovian for me. I like wall, look over the wall. It's never anything. Maybe 1 out of 100, it's a stepwell. And this was like, okay, next slide. You look over the wall. It's just this incredible structure. Next slide. Like there's nothing like this. This goes down 10 stories. And you see how you're looking through it. You're looking through layers of architecture, and you're 9 stories below grade while you're doing it. There's nothing that compares to that in the Western canon of architecture. I was gobsmacked. Like that is the spot where I thought, oh my God, I have to now change my trip and see every stepwell I could. And you know, that was 10 years ago. I saw 30 of them, and I just kept going back and seeing more and more and more. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to go down to Googe Route, which you can find on that map. It's like on the southwest side, and we're going to see the one that you were talking about, Andrew. Next slide. The oldest stepwells that are still extant are in Googe Route, just for various political reasons more than anything. They existed in the north too, but they managed to survive where a lot of the other ones were destroyed. But this one, Ranikival, which you were discussing, this did become a World Heritage Site. And strangely, it's one of the only stepwells that we have any real information about that survives because of panels that existed that are still on the walls. But what we know is this, you know, now you will see, oh, there's a wall. Victoria's going to take us to the wall. Next slide. You see a stupid wall, and then you go there, and it's like, what the heck? It's just, you can't even fathom how big this thing is. It is from the mid-11th century. It is the most grandiose, expensive, the largest, most complicated stepwell that was ever built. It was commissioned by Queen Udayamati to commemorate her dead husband. And there's a book about it that's out of print. And it took like 20 years to create this. Next slide. It gives you a better idea if you look at that isometric drawing of it. It was just enormous. There were giant buttresses to keep the earth from collapsing in on it. That is the most clay, loamy, stupid soil that you could imagine. And by the way, there is no stone that exists in this town. Every single stone had to be brought in from 140 kilometers away in Patan. That's where this is, but it was brought in from 140 kilometers. Next slide. But what happened was sort of tragic. So Queen Udayamati completes this stepwell. It's incredible. I'm sure her husband, you know, Bhima, was really happy about it from the other world. And then within 100 years after its completion, the underground kind of water source, which in this case was the Saraswati River, changed course and went right through the stepwell, collapsed it, silted it up for like 1,000 years. And, well, not quite 1,000 years, but you see in the slide on the left, that's a photo from the 19th century that the British took. That's all they saw were these stumpy little columns above ground, not the one on the right, the one on the left, and just the end of it, which was the wellhead. Nobody had any idea what was down there. It was just a pit. Until the slide on the right, the Archaeological Survey of India started to excavate it in the 1970s and then the 80s and realized it was like the discovery of Pompeii. This thing was enormous. It had been so well preserved, next slide please, because of the silt, that it is really one of the most remarkable finds in India. There's 700, 800 beautiful sculptures. You can see the next slide, how complex this thing is. It is considered some of the best sculpture of that time period. Everything finely detailed, all this stone, again, brought from 140 kilometers away. And it finally became a UNESCO World Heritage Site just a few years ago. It took a long time for it to get on that list. Next slide. And I'll just say this, and then I'm going to let you ask some questions. I'm sorry, I'm just going on about my thing. But
that's why we're here, to be honest. So. Go on.
Well, I feel mean, but what's really interesting, like, you know, sometimes people go and see Rani ki Vav, Vav, or Vav as it's spelled, is another name for Stepwell. There's a million different names for them. But as I said, there's no stone in the town of Patan. So over the course of the centuries, people would go and just cannibalize what was sticking up above ground. And when you drive through that little town, you just see pieces of this incredible stepwell all over the place, like somebody's cow shed, a bench, whatever. But the greatest cannibal job was the Bahadur Singh stepwell, which is just 5 kilometers away from that giant, incredible thing. Bahadur Singh owned the property, allegedly, that Rani Stepwell was on, decided in the early 19th century, when it was really late for a stepwell, but he decided these were really great sources of water for irrigation. He had fields around there, so he decides he's going to build a stepwell, you know, get water all the time. Goes to Rani and just takes whatever he could take and builds this little beautiful stepwell, next slide, which is filled with elements from an 11th century stepwell. So it's like in a 19th century shell, and you've got a much better feeling of what it's like, this transcendent experience of entering a stepwell by going down and that whole transformation that occurs. You feel that in this tiny little fake-o, you know, cannibalized stepwell than you do at Rani. But you can see that things are really uneven. When Bahadur Singh, he just grabbed the columns that he could grab. They didn't necessarily fit. So if you look closely, you'll see their little plinths at the bottom. He just stuck in pieces of, you know, other stone. But it's a remarkable thing because you can, it's great actually to have both of them. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Excellent.
Excellent that I'm stopping?
No.
Shut up, my turn.
Go on. So there's kind of two other traditions within this tradition. You have the Muslim coming in and then the Hindus. And traditional Muslim culture will not allow iconography, right? But then the traditional Hindu is like, there's your Ganesh and da-da-da. Do you see a conflict or a suppression between these two, or did it lead to some kind of beautiful synthesis where you had like the sacred geometry of you find in like mosques in Istanbul merging with, you know, the statuary from that part of India and things like that?
You did read that book. You read it closely.
Yeah, you know.
I stopped at the perfect point to illustrate what you're asking me. Thank you. Very good interviewer. Yes, perfect. It was really interesting what happened. Everything you say is true, that in terms of, yeah, the Hindu stepwells are all about, you know, if we're going to make this into a subterranean temple, and even if it wasn't a temple, there were always some kind of deity that you recognize in the stepwell, and they're named for particular deities, and often mother deities, female, Mata Bhavani, all mother, Mata, or Rani, you know, whatever. When the Muslims really begin their major incursion in the 15th century, and really in this stepwell here, Dada Harir is a perfect example. In Ahmedabad, outside of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, Ahmedabad was founded by Ahmad Shah in 1411. Now, we all know in this group, I'm sure, that there's a rich historical tradition of water architecture in Islam. I mean, they loved incorporating water into their structures, and you think of beautiful water courses and fountains and all the stuff that they have. If you've been to, you know, Granada or anywhere that there was Muslim architecture, it's fantastic. But they'd never seen a stepwell. They didn't need a stepwell. Nobody had stepwells except for India because nobody had that crazy climate. So they were just gobsmacked when they saw stepwells, and in fact issued an edict that even though they were disemboweling temples, tearing them down, incorporating them into other buildings, you could not destroy a stepwell. And then they built many of their own. Some of the most beautiful ones are Islamic, but in like the northern parts of India, you just don't get Hindu stepwells. They just don't exist. But you do still get them in Gujarat. And for this brief period of time, for like, I don't know, it's like 50 years maybe, max. You get this style, this Islamadu style, that combines both. Because as I said, in that one structure, Chand Bowery, the Hindu structures, those craftsmen really knew what they were doing in terms of subterranean architecture and the types of carving they did. And they were bringing the broad canvas of subterranean stepwells. But Islam brought, as you can see in this slide, the true arch, the true dome, not these core-built flat things on top of each other. So you begin to see a merging of Islamic style, Islamic flourishes using Hindu craftsmen. The next slide, please. Octagonal, the octagon is really important in Islam. And you see in the slide on the right, this is the wellhead where, in this case, there still are animal forms and floral forms that are being used, which later you won't even get those because everything is like, no, you can't have any kind of adornment. But in those niches that you see, next slide, yeah, thank you. Yeah, there. You can see on the left, that's actually, you would normally get in the wellhead, that's from Rani, the Rani Ki Vav, the one that became the World Heritage Site, Sleeping Vishnu. You would always get like some form of a deity basically blessing the water. And you get these all through the stepwell. So once the Muslims were beginning to build, these are like, no, we're not going to put a Hindu deity in here, but we'll put something that maybe relates to that ideology, and it will be okay for both of us. So you get these very stylized forms, like this flower form on the right. Next slide. Or like on the left, this would be very common. You would see these kind of deity forms together, but that little swirly thing in the background becomes a tree of life, which is an important symbol both in Hindu and in Islam. So they began to just, unite their forms in a way that would appeal to all constituents. But it didn't last for very long. And really, by the 17th century, you don't get any of that. It's all very you just don't get any kind of flourishes like that. Let me see what the next slide is. Oh, one other thing. This is another form that that the Muslims brought, which is really interesting. Stepwells that I showed you up to this point are all very externalized. It's all like open to the elements, open to the people. You see the stairs, you can see everything, go in it, blah, blah, blah. But when the Muslims came, they created a whole separate form. And it's it's considered, it's like this internalized, separate, private form that is really a retreat kind of a stepwell that were often found in forts and in private gardens like this one, which is in the absolute middle of nowhere. And when I first saw it, I didn't realize what I was looking for. I was looking for a stepwell. It was the first one of these stepwells I'd seen. I was like, what is this? It's like a dance platform. It looks like a subway grate or something. It's just like this thing. But, you can't even go there anymore. Next slide. It's basically, it's a thing that was just meant for this one. He was like a general in the local ruler's army. And the whole thing is just a giant shaft around which are these rooms. And there's a mechanism for drawing up the water from the middle. It was just used for the women of the family in Purda to go and retreat in these very hot times. They would be in these rooms around the exterior, not the ones that had light. And in fact, I forced myself to go into some super creepy places and out on ledges where I could have died, and I broke my foot twice and, risked my life, damn it, for this project. But I would not go in that room because there's lots of bats in India. I don't even mind looking at bats, but that room was screeching with bats, screeching. It was like Carlsbad Cavern. And I knew if I went in it and a click went off in my camera, they would just all come out in my face. So I took that picture. But that's where the women would have been, in this type of retreat well. Next picture. This is another one. This is at the fort in Agra. The guy who ran the fort, who I convinced to try and take me to this thing, had never even heard of this thing, didn't know it was there. And again, it looks like a subway grate. You would never know This is one of the most complex subterranean structures ever. Next slide. You can't tell from this picture, next slide, but this is what it looks like. Next slide. It goes down 7 stories underground, winds around. This was for Emperor Akbar. There's a 2-story room on 2 different sides. It's all painted on the ceiling, and there's a spiral staircase that goes around, and then another straight staircase that goes way out the side. It's one of the most extraordinary things that nobody will ever see, and another example of a form of architecture we should know about, and in this case, a very private one. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to stop there again, because the next part is all about what happened, why don't we know about them.
Cool. Another fascinating part of this is, this idea of like technical transmission in a pre-internet age, right? So how did the knowledge of kind of Arabic geometry get transmitted to craftsmen and craftswomen in India? Is that known, or is it just kind of?
Well, no, and first of all, you know, I mean, the Hindus were no slouches. They didn't need Arabic geometry.
But those styles were imported from the Middle East,
What
right?
were?
The dome styles were.
Well, that, yeah, but I mean, that was, to them, it was sort of like, oh, they had, you know, if you look at sites in Dolivera or places, they had the earliest, like, running troughs from 5000 BC. They were really good at engineering and water management, but, you know, I presume that there were, when in a city like Ahmedabad, Ahmad Shah brought his own engineers with him, but they were working with Hindu craftsmen who could understand that. They were pretty smart. And all of that stuff, I mean, the trade routes around India were so well established from north to south and east to west that that stuff traveled really, really quickly. And so I have to imagine that it, you know, I mean, they were building the Taj Mahal before too long, so that stuff was widely disseminated.
Yeah, and then there's another fascinating fact in your book that a water diviner was used by the British occupying powers until 1923. And so this whole notion of, because it took about 20 years to build one, right?
Well, it depends. It took 20 years to build a really ornate one. Some of the others probably less.
But that, I mean, at the time, that's a generational endeavor. So how would people know where to do this? Because the water tables are rising. There's no radar. Is any of that known? Or
No.
Wow,
Isn't that wild? I mean, that is the thing that we just cannot know. But I asked a lot of people about that question. Like, we don't know how many times they started to dig a well and never found water. We only know about the ones where they did find water. We don't even know about the ones that collapsed. We only know about the one because we dug it out again. But one of the people I spoke to about that was educating me on the whole idea of water management in India and how far back it goes, and how smart those people were about, I mean, there's a reason that civilization has been around as long as it has. And stuff that I would never even notice, like a tiny indentation in the ground, a certain type of plant, how tall the plants are, all of those things are indications of the type of water, where it is. You know, I mean, that's just how you learn to live in the desert, you know. The Fremen figured it out on, you know, in Dune. It's something that you learn. But water divination is still very active in India. I mean, there are people who swear by it, modern people spend a lot of money on it, and people who think it's a bunch of bunkum. But however they were figuring it out, they were able to, in the middle of absolute nowhere, find water in places where, you know, it wasn't always that easy to do. Was it the diviners? Was it the engineers? Was it the plant specialists? I'm sure they all worked together. And, you know, just like now, I know people in the Southwest who hire well diggers, and you pay them and they will dig, they'll say, we'll dig in 3 places, but I don't guarantee that I'm going to hit anything. I'm sure it was like that then. They just were using oxen and their hands, basically. It's an incredible thing. But yeah, the fact that the Army had one on staff really cracked me up.
Because it was even part of like the building process is they would wait for the wet season for the water table to rise and then excavate further. And
well, they actually only excavated in the dry season. I mean, you couldn't excavate in the wet season. It was really problematic. Because even now, you know, they still dig a lot of bore wells in India. That's been a lot of the problem. And a lot of those are still not, I mean, they will use equipment when they can, but the minute you hit water, you have to work really fast to shore up the walls. Like, there's no way you can dig in the wet season. So hitting it at the right spot, finding the right spot in the water table is crucial. And in a place like, well, like in Patan, where Rani Kibau, there was an underground water source. They built the stepwell far enough away that it was good for 100 years. Nobody could predict that the underground stream was going to switch course, and that ruined everything. So, you know, maybe that happened millions of times, and we just have no idea.
And yeah, I have another question about kind of local historical knowledge. The West traces its kind of historical chronology from the life of Christ. What is it in Hindu? Like, how old are these things? Is it like a different cyclical pattern that they use for their historical knowledge? So when they say it's very old, does that mean something different to a local that's on a different kind of time cycle, if that makes sense?
I have no idea. It makes sense to me, but it's not dated like that. I mean, yeah, when they say very old in Varanasi, I have no idea what that means. And I don't really know the Hindu calendar at all. So if you're trying to trip me up, fella, you did. But I don't know.
That's an honest question.
I mean, they don't, yeah, but I don't know. I mean, they don't, when you ask locals about these stepwells, you don't get specifics. Like, nobody has specifics. What you get is, like, well, you know, when I would ask people, when was this built? Oh, it's very, very old. Well, who built it? Well, a giant built it. A ghost built it. What was the ghost? Why? Well, the ghost was upset with blah, 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 and overnight the goat, you know, it's always mythic. It's always a very similar myth about a ghost. There's almost always, it's fed by the river Ganga, which is way up north in Varanasi. It's always got a hidden pathway to Delhi or someplace. You know, so there's never any specific information about it. And yes, if you look at the few wall panels that exist, which say, I built this well in the year blah, 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 you have to translate that from the Urdu or, you know, whatever language it happened. There can be 3 different languages. It can be in Hindu or Urdu or, you know, lots of things. And there's been a lot of confusion about that. And scholars argue about it all the time. And there can be 3 different dates by 3 different centuries that scholars ascribe these to. So it makes it very, very difficult to know anything.
Yeah. And then, yeah, another kind of fascinating thing is these seem to be thought of as individual acts of patronage, really. But lots of great works are considered to be a part of a broader political economic system, like the pyramids. There's a whole society built up around that. And you could probably argue the same for like the more well-known Hindu temples. But was it just like, yeah, one charitable act from an oligarch, or was there a broader societal need that like made the sacred water necessary and things like that? Was there this kind of capsule for it of a religious economic nature?
You know, I think that's completely unknown. We don't even know who built half of these things. It's like they're just unknown. What the ones that we do know that were charitable acts, that was just because, you know, you want to be remembered. I know that in the Vedic texts, it actually specifies that building a stepwell for the community is considered at the same spiritual level as building a temple. So you got the same kind of karmic reward for building a stepwell, which is why people wanted to build them. But it's just unknown. Like, if entire groups in the society got together to do it, who was funding them, the information just doesn't exist. So yeah, I mean, it's the Egyptians kept much better records of that stuff.
Cool. Well,
unfortunately.
My curiosity is briefly stated, if you'd like to
Oh, good.
continue.
Well, we're almost done. People always ask me, like, Well, what happened, and next slide, I used to just blame it all on the British, but that's not really fair.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, a whole bunch of things converged around the 18th century. The Mughal empire began to fracture and break up. Just, you know, politically, things got really hairy.
Can you give like a date and kind of 2-second? Who were the Mughals? What was the empire?
Well, the Mughals were the ruling power in India up until about the 18th century. They were Muslim, so India was like basically Hindu with a bunch of other things, you know, obviously going on to Jain, and I don't want to go into the whole thing. But from about the 15th century on, it was Islamic, and a lot of Islam was Mughal. When you say Mughal, it was Islamic. That's who took over Delhi. That's who built the Taj Mahal. And when the British came, they were basically taking over and routing the Mughals for the most part. There's a huge, broad generalization. So I apologize to any Indians listening because I've just fractured.
Were the Mughals a foreign force, or was it like a spiritual
Originally,
movement?
they were, well, it was both. I mean,
Yeah.
They originated in Persia, some in Afghanistan, and it was Islamic as opposed to Hindu.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's why you get a lot of really great mosques in India and really great temples. You get both because they were existing, you know, together. But when the British came, you know, they were having none of it. And it was really the Mughals specifically who were their enemy at that point that they were trying to put down. The British Raj was against the Mughals for the most part. And so that the whole society was beginning to fracture by the 18th and early 19th century. And people didn't have money to spend on Stepwells at the same time that the British were making inroads with, you know, progress. Modern pumps like the one in this picture, or village tanks, or eventually plumbing that could come to these villages. It made it a lot easier to get water. And it was all about getting water. That was the primary thing. Next slide. So that once you removed, untethered, the original purpose of Stepwells from, you know, what they were supposed to do, which was supply water, you know, people weren't going to keep them up as much. It was a lot of effort to keep them clean. People were going there for washing, for irrigating, for, you know, they still maybe kept them up as temples or shrines. But even in the case of doing that, things started to get really messy, and they began to fade from their importance in the community. At the same time, next slide, cities began to be built up around them. Like this one I just showed like 4 pictures of, the ones before. This is like a 13th, early 14th century stepwell with incredible carving in it that is just going to hell. Look at it, it's just completely getting trashed. And in order to even get these pictures, and I have to do this a lot in India, like I could see the stepwell was there, but in order to get photographs, I had to knock on people's doors, ask to climb on their roofs, ask to hang out their window, you know, all these things that here, and people always said yes. Always said, please come in, let me give you tea, can I serve you dinner, come and spend the night. Whereas here you'd be shot within 15 minutes, the police would come and get you, you know, you'd be dead. I mean, I literally, it was incredible that people did this, but this is a perfect example of a fantastic stepwell that probably was just, you know, out on the outskirts of a village, and here it's completely subsumed into the town that grew up around it. Next slide. And it's completely trashed at this point. When I was writing the book, it was really important for me to give the GPS coordinates because it was so hard for me to find these. I didn't have GPS. I was driving around in circles. I mean, it was interesting to do it like that, but I wanted to make it easy for people to see it. And the hardest thing about this book, harder than any of it, harder than writing it in 3.5 months or finding the information or any of that, was getting the GPS coordinates for some of these, which are embedded in these towns now. And I had to hire people to go and find the stepwells and send me the GPS coordinates like this one, which is a fantastic stepwell, but is it also an example of not just being embedded in a town. And this, look at this, it's 12th century. Next slide. but literally the town was built on top of it, and they've been pilfering the stone, and you can't even tell anymore, but there were 3 entrances, and this would have been an incredible, ornate, deep, marvelous stepwell. And just this kind of thing does make me cry, but you know, who's going to go to this place? You know, Kapanvanj, India, like nobody goes there. Next slide. This was another example of one that was really hard to find. I think they may have cleaned this now. I'm not sure, but I also began to change my attitude about, like, I was so mad all the time. Like, I was ranting at these Indians, like, how can you do this? This is important. Don't you realize? And then I thought, you're being an idiot. You know, here's a country where I've seen 2 garbage cans, garbage trucks the entire time I've gone to India. I've been there, like, you know, dozens of times. I haven't even counted anymore. And like, if you have a giant pit outside your window that nobody cares about, and you have a choice between throwing trash on the road or throwing it in that pit, it's a good idea to throw it in the pit. But consequently, a lot of these important stepwells, this one's huge and amazing, it would have been incredible, they're filled up with garbage now. It's sad, but you know, they're being used. Next slide. And some of these are just, they've made it impossible. Like this one is in the zoo in Jodhpur. I knew it was there. I could see it through a fence. And I went to this guy who's the head zookeeper, and I said, could you please let me in? You know, I'm a journalist. Please let me take pictures. And I tell you, this is the only man in India who could not be bribed. Nothing. Tears, begging, rupees thrown at him, nothing. And I had to go and get an ASI official, and you could see how mad this guy is at me just by the way he's walking. He's pissed. So next slide. And he had to unlock the zoo the goose enclosure. I'm like kicking geese out of the way to get to this probably 18th, 17th century stepwell. But now I've heard that they're actually fixing this stepwell and that they've moved the zoo. So I don't know. I think that the book has had an impact. I think I've embarrassed a lot of people, which is good. My favorite thing. I go back and visit some of these stepwells every few years, and you can see they're just falling apart. That one really looks malevolent now. The next one, next slide, this one, you can just see the vegetation's beginning to creep down, like in Cambodia. It's just gonna be eaten away soon. Another slide. But this is a really important picture. There's that, you know, the stepwell from Delhi, Agra Senkibauli on the left. That's a picture from the 70s, 1972, Raghu Rai, who did that picture. And that was, you could see the water in Delhi at that point. The water table was just like 26 feet below the surface, whereas now it's 250 because of, well, vast city, illegal bore wells, too many people, too much, there's no water can permeate anymore because of the, you know, everything's paved. It's like what's happening everywhere. And you can see this is one of the problems that even when they try and reinvigorate the stepwells now, next slide, you can't reach the water table most of the time because there's no way to get to it. In other cases, you know, people, like on the left, this is a 11th century stepwell where the community decided, okay, well, this is being protected by the government, but we want to use it as a temple. And so they started just tchotchking it up. They added all these modern sculptures. They're having a great time. It's a fabulous place. It's just like going to a stepwell 1,000 years ago. There's people chanting and animals running around. And so, but the one on the right from the same period, the government has said it's protected, and that's what it looks like when it's protected. It's falling apart. It's just junk. And I was having this meeting with a government official about the one on the left. He's like, yeah, we really have to go in and take down all those sculptures. Those people are encroaching on it. That's bad. I'm like, are you crazy? They're preserving it. So what if they add some ugly contemporary sculptures? Look at the one on the right. Who wants that? So my ideas of preservation have totally changed. Next slide. I think I'm just about done. You know, when there's water, you see a lot of irrigation. People still drink out of these too, which is horrifying because the water's super toxic. But it's great that that water's pretty clear. They, you know, are watering their animals and their lands. Next slide. And contemporary architecture and using these as inspiration has been really interesting. More recently, Charles Correa, who's the famous, now deceased Anglo-Indian, who used a lot of Stepwell imagery influence in his work. Next slide. Or Sanjay Puri, this is an unbuilt project on the right, but it's based on like these Kund steps. And you know, the fact that architects are incorporating these things means that they're being preserved somehow in the public consciousness. Next slide. Oh, it's the bane of my existence. I just hate this thing. And when I saw this drawing like 6 years ago, I remember thinking, no way, they're never going to build that. It was $163 million at the time, $200 million. This is a reverse Stepwell, Heatherwick Studios, the vessel in New York. And I said at the time in all my talks, this is going to be a suicide magnet. They'll never build it. Next slide. But they did build it. And of course, it's based on Stepwell's. Heatherwick, who I wrote to several times, you know, never really credited, never credited Stepwell's. Really, he just said it was based on Stepwell's, but never said anything about it. And of course, now it's closed permanently because there have been 4 suicides there in the last 2 years. It's just a travesty. And Stepwell's never got anything out of it. But some places in India are now figuring the only way to preserve these is to somehow monetize them through tourism. This place outside of Jodhpur, where you can go and have the most romantic, crazy dinner outside their Stepwell, and they sing music and they bring you food, and it's absolutely fantastic and nuts. Next slide, please. The post office issued a set of stamps, 16 stamps, just a couple of years ago. They all sold out with all Stepwells on them, none of which are mine, but I didn't care. I was glad they were doing that. And the next slide, they, oh, I guess I didn't include the picture of a 100 rupee note has a Stepwell on it now too. Finally, this is what can happen when you preserve a Stepwell. This is in Jodhpur. I walked by this like 6 years ago. I knew it was a Stepwell, but it was just this stinking morass of a pit with just floating detritus, but a very fancy hotel right behind it. And the people who own that hotel, next slide, decided that they were going to clean this thing out. They had no idea what it looked like. It had only been filled up with water for like 3 centuries. 500, you know, carts of sludge. Nothing very interesting, apparently. Next slide. And now it looks like this. Or next slide. It has become the most popular spot in Jodhpur, and people are always swimming in it and jumping in it. It's become a magnet for the community. It's transformed the entire city. And now more people are finally taking notice of it because it's drawing tourists. And the last slide is me. When I first fell in love with that Stepwell at Nimrana, and I was terrified, the steps are really uneven, broken, steep. I was sure I was going to fall and die into the maw of that pit at the end. And so I asked my Hindi-speaking driver, because I do this by myself. I mean, it was stupid and crazy. But, and I no longer dress like an Indian when I go, because that was stupid too. But I said to my driver, you know, will you please take my picture, because I want to show my son when I die that I was happy in my last moments. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. So when are you going back?
I wish I was going back soon, but you know, it's been really difficult in India, and things have opened up there now. And I'm hoping to maybe go back early next year. You know, I'm hoping, but I mean, we just keep going through these waves, so who knows?
Yeah, and then I guess to take some wisdom from this, it seems that the best way to preserve them is to revitalize their original purpose, right?
Exactly, yeah. Right, we've come full circle. Yeah, I mean, they need the water now. They finally realize, oh, what they were doing 1,000 years ago was really helpful. Why can't we do that? And a lot of the villages, I have a Google alert for Stepwells, and I'm constantly getting things about this village and that village. I mean, it really is great that in the last few years, because of India's water crisis, there has been so much interest in like revitalizing and cleaning and readopting these wells. So that's great. But for every one that they preserve, there's probably 5 that, are being blown up. And, I went to one that, like, the day before they paved it over to make a parking lot. I mean, literally, that's what's happening. So it's the ones that got away that I worry about. Yeah, shopping mall, exactly.
A parking lot for a shopping mall. All right. Well, thank you. You've infused my life with such brilliance and wonderfulness. I'm glad we had this moment, and I'd like to share said wonderfulness with the audience. Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Absolutely. Thank you. Good questions. Ones I couldn't answer.
I'm going to take the first question. That is, when are you doing the TED Talk?
I wrote to them, and they ignored me. I'd love to do a TED Talk.
Keep writing.
Wow, interesting. Had no idea. Thank you very much for sharing. So to your point on monetizing this and somehow getting the tourist angle, have you looked at maybe meeting with the editors at Lonely Planet or some of these other travel guides to try to work this into their maps and their story and their recommendations? And also, everyone loves lists, so maybe the 20 most spectacular stepwells in India that you got to go see on your next vacation, that kind of thing.
I have been remarkably lame in getting any kind of publicity like that. I cannot tell you, and I sort of gave up. I mean, I'm glad I wrote the book, and there was certainly there was attention, really more before the book came out. What got me the book was a story that was written about me searching for these stepwells. It went viral, and that got picked up and written about all over the place. But I have written to Lonely Planet, to a lot of those guidebook companies, and they've included more of them in now, like Chand and Ronnie are now in some of the guidebooks, but I can't get any traction from any of that stuff, and I just gave up. It's like, I've done my part, What's more important is that a couple of tour companies in India are now incorporating stepwells on their tours. That's really important to me. And finally, in India, there are people writing guidebooks about the stepwells. There's one that just came out about stepwells in Delhi. Because when I was doing this talk in India, I mean, it was almost embarrassing. Like, this middle-aged white girl from, at that point from the Midwest. And I kept saying, I'm not who should be doing this. You guys should be doing it. But one person said to me, and I think he was right, he said, often we don't get paid attention to you, and you need the eyes from somebody else. Like, these people, they were walking by these stepwells every day and not even paying attention to them.
Huell Hauser comes to mind. But,
That's amazing. No, you can totally do snarky Yelp reviews.
Yes, exactly.
Get the ball rolling on that. People will defend it.
So it's been said that the missions built along the Spanish Trail were done so within a day's ride. Do you find a similar pattern where there's a certain radius between the stepwells?
It's really hard to tell because I don't know where they are. And it's weird, too, because sometimes you'll get, like, 3 stepwells within, like, 50 feet of each other, and then there won't be any for I don't know how far. There was no way for me to map them. Now, because people have been paying more attention, and there's websites which are posting them and stuff, and a lot of people now are going in search of them, you probably could do that much better. But for sure, there had to have been a network along those routes that were all within a day's drive. There was no other way to do it back in like the 1400s, the 1200s. So, but so many of them, like the one that I found, that cow herd, if I hadn't run into him, I would have never known it was there. Nobody would have known it was there. So, I mean, it was an adventure. That was definitely, and I would love to go back and find more like that, but it's so haphazard that it's really hard to know. Good question.
How long did this whole entire project take you? Did it feel shorter by the end of it, or did it feel a lot longer than you expected? It's a great question. I never expected it. It wasn't ever a project. It was like a whim. I went to India. I had been going to India
saw a stepwell 35 years ago, go back 10 years ago for 3 months. There were 3 stories I was working on that I had done some research on. I had no intention of, I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd given up my journalistic career in Chicago, and I just really wanted to do something different and an adventure, and I loved India. When I got obsessed with the stepwells and started going back, it was still without any intention other than pursuing this thing. After about 5 years, I started writing to a lot of places and saying, I'd like to do an article about this. And I mean, I thought it was like the best story on the planet with the best photographs, even though they were stupid. But I was like an unknown entity doing, like, a lot of times people don't want to hear, oh, here's something you don't know about, you know, by somebody that they never heard of. By the time I finally got the book contract, I had been doing it for like 9 years, and I was about to give up because I was so discouraged that I actually wrote on Facebook, of all places. I was like, no, I'm not going to do it anymore. You know, you're not going to see any more pictures. And there was this outcry, and it was actually because of that that people started sending me ideas like, call this person, call that person, that actually led to the publisher who published the book, who's a jerk, but he did publish the book. And otherwise I would have given up, you know? And so it's hard to say, was it long or short? It was not anything that I ever intended to do to begin with, you know? It was just a weird fluke. My life went from here to there. And now I'm still trying to find another way to go. So thank you for asking that.
So is Ellora considered to be a stepwell?
Is what?
Ellora?
No. Ellora is not. Those are temples. Those are subterranean. And they're amazing. And they're all rock cut. They're not really subterranean. Well, some of them are. It depends. They're more caves. There's lots of things that look like stepwells and that people often refer to as stepwells. A lot of times what comes up are the cisterns in Turkey. If you go, there's those wonderful Roman cisterns, because they're underground and they're water, and you have to take steps to go to them. But really, and there's lots of things that involve steps and water. But it was the intention of the Indian stepwells and the way that they're created that's different. Mm-hmm. The fact that they had a draw well, the fact that they had a mechanism to bring water up, but separately had steps going down to them. Just having steps and water isn't enough. But there is a great website, but it's really infuriating, that came up after the book called stepwells.org. This guy, Philip Arist, really great guy from England, who decided to set out to document every stepwell on Earth. And we've had a lot of conversations about it, because it's like, well, there's only stepwells really, Phil, you know, in India and Pakistan. He's like, he has stuff like in Arizona, you know, a fountain. And it really bothers me because, you know, now people think there's stepwells everywhere, but like something built in 1962 with a fountain with steps is not a stepwell in my book, but I'm being a purist. But I heard somebody mention GPS and Google Earth. You know, I use Google Earth to get the coordinates for a lot of these. But you still can't see a lot of them. You have to know so specifically where you're looking. I can't tell you the nights I spent the hours looking for some of them where I thought I knew exactly where it was, and you still can't see them. You know, they're tiny or they're overgrown, and you just can't see them from the air. So, I mean, it's a very interesting thing. But I urge you all to go on Google Earth, find stepwells, and then post them so that people know where to. I can't wait to go back to India to see some that people have sent me.
So as Islam spread, like, for example, Indonesia and Hinduism, did any of that reach any of that area?
Did what?
Okay, as Islam spread,
yeah,
and Hinduism in like Bali and parts of Indonesia, Java and stuff, any stepwell type things there?
No, because like in places where, like in Indonesia or even South India, where there's plenty of water, there's no need for a stepwell. You get tanks, temple tanks, lots of water features. But a stepwell that needs to empty and fill according to the monsoon, that does not exist in those places because the weather system doesn't exist anywhere else. It's really about that weird weather. Nowhere else is dry for so long and then 2 solid months of a monsoon that could be predicted with such accuracy that they knew exactly when it was going to hit and could create an architecture specifically for it. Yeah.
Chad.
I have so many questions.
Oh, good. Well, you might have to ask me separately because I think people want to go home.
Okay. Okay. I'll try and leave it to a couple. So you said that one was government commissioned. Was that common, or do you think that was unusual?
No, you misunderstood. I never said that. I said they're government protected.
No, the queen.
Oh, the Queen Udayamati. Yeah, but she wasn't, well, the government. She was a queen in the 11th century. Does that make her government?
Yeah. I mean,
okay, so you're talking about like different queens and kings or the government. Okay, yeah, no, a lot of them were commissioned by the government of the day, meaning the local ruler.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So that was common.
Yes.
Okay. And then, do you know how many people it took and how long to make them?
We have no idea because those records don't exist. It's all like we know approximately because other people have told me that they think it would take X amount of time to do this type of well, like the really big fancy one that you were talking about, the Queen's Well, that is the. What just happened?
You're
oh,
there.
sorry. That is the World Heritage Site. The guy who studied that well his entire life and did a book about it said that he thought it took 20 years. But I don't know what he's basing it on, you know. He's just pulling that out of the air too. But they have a general idea how long it takes to dig things out, and it's based on there's certain records in India. Like Emperor Akbar kept very good records of building, for instance, his city, Fatehpur Sikri, and the Taj Mahal. They know how long it took to do those things. So they're supposing from a lot of that stuff that it would take X amount of time to do this. But as far as the number of people, no. But, you know, they had nothing but slaves and workmen and just millions of souls that they could throw at it, like in Egypt.
Right. And then my last question would be, is there any evidence of specific artisans that did the work? So, like, is there a signature or a tag or a style where they're like,
of
okay, this person did that, yes?
No, well, as in Egypt, as in all of those, it's a caste-based system. And I mean, it's so rare. It's really, it's not until very late in any culture, really, even in Western culture, that you get the names, specific names of like the architects. We know in Greece, okay, there's Praxiteles and there's, certain people who did things. But in Egypt, we don't know who built most of those things. We know the ruler who commissioned it. We know in India that there are specific castes that were doing, the engineering. The Brahmins, for instance, would have been the people that were doing the designing. But the castes that are specifically doing the digging of the earth, the Banjaras, I mean, that group, they're still the diggers. They're like one of the poorest classes that you get. The people who are carving the stones, the people who, like, every single thing has a caste attached to it, and they're still doing that stuff. They're still locked into that system. So because of that, like, an individual will never rise out of that.
Okay, and then my last question. I think I said that before, but I'll say it again. Does each one kind of have like a theme? Like, and was there like, do you think that there was like an overall vision for the project, and then like all the artisans kind of followed that idea?
There's not a theme particularly. I mean, these are great questions. The Queen Udayamati is the one with all of that sculpture on the inside. I mean, these are all scenes from the Ramayana. I'm pretty sure it's the Ramayana. So like you can go and you can recognize actual scenes if you know the Ramayana, like this is what's happening here, this is what's happening there. The way you would like in the Patsy Chapel or something, you know, and you'd know, well, this is the scene from the Bible where this is happening. You could recognize it. But in most of them, no, it's just like a decorative, I mean, a lot of them aren't even decorative. It was just, you know, there might be a shrine or many shrines to different deities, but there wasn't like one unifying theme, like we're going to do an entire, you know, architectural project based on Ganesha or something. No, I haven't seen that. The closest is, you know, Queen Udayamati's one, because that's just insane. But I've never seen anything like that. You get some of that more in temples, but not in Stepwells.
And I'll go with a question from the chat attributed to Harmony Solo. Did Victoria drink the water?
I'm not crazy.
Oh, come on now. You're amongst friends.
But I've been, listen, I went to a lot of, there are a number of those which are still really important pilgrimage sites where drinking the water is part of it. And, you know, I watched people drink the water as the pigeons were floating in it and giving the water to their babies. And I mean, when the British came and they destroyed a lot of them, I mean, they were, of course, horrified by seeing, it was like the antithesis of 19th century British, like, hygiene. Open sewers, they thought. But, you know, the thing is that the Indians were keeping them clean, and they'd also built up, as people do, you know, a lot of resistance to what they were drinking. And so to them, it wasn't, I don't know, maybe they were having vast outbreaks of typhoid, but they were in London too until relatively recently. So the water, no, is not sanitary. I would not drink it. Nobody that I know in India drinks the water from their everybody has major systems of, you know, zapping it or running it through this, or the water is not safe. But, you know, neither is some of the water in our country, but it's really bad there. I mean, it's really bad. So whoever asked that, ha.
Haha, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm sorry, I've had a bag of books in my car, but you can get the books. They're really inexpensive on Amazon, and if you get it and you want me to sign it, I can't believe I left them in my car.
If anyone wants a book, I will run to the car and get it so you can sign in the rest, or we can make this happen.
I can run to the car and get it.
We've got a runner.
But, I mean, you don't have to either. Or you can just order it and email me, and I will send you the thing. It doesn't matter. I don't care about whatever you want. It's fine.
So you're taking that tradition of not having a signed artist thing, right? You're from just the Explorer cast.
I am willing to I have these little things that I send people where I sign it and you can put it in the book. I don't really understand signed books anyway, but, you know, but I'm happy to do it, and I do have the books. I was just stupid and left them in my car.
Well, I'm looking forward to having you sign my copy.
I'll sign yours.
Which contains all the GPS, so we have to step out of the interwebs now and into the club. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Please share this story and like and explore and subscribe if you'd like. And take care of yourselves out there. Keep on adventuring. Thank you.
Thank you.